The invitation said 7 o'clock. I know that because I still have it. I kept it in the little drawer by my bed, the one where I keep things I tell myself I will deal with later. The envelope was cream-colored, with my name written in cursive on the front. My name, not my husband's, not the family name. Mine, and that detail alone should have told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. But I did not find out I was uninvited from my own baby shower until the morning of the event, not the day before, not through a phone call, through a group text. A group text that I was not even added to. My sister-in-law forwarded it to me by accident. I know it was an accident because 30 seconds later she sent me a string of emojis, and then her phone went straight to voicemail when I called back. And when I tell you that I sat on the edge of my bed, 7 months pregnant, still in the oversized t-shirt I had slept in, and read those words 3 times before they fully landed, I want you to understand that it was not the shock that hurt the most. It was how clean it was, like I had always been optional. My name is Rachel. Rachel Delaney Kowalski, though for 3 years I went by Rachel Kowalski, and I practiced writing that name on post-it notes like a teenager with a crush. I am telling you that detail because I want you to know how much I had already given up before any of this started. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just quietly, the way you give things up when you love someone and you are trying to become part of something bigger than yourself. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, middle child, practical family. My mother packed lunches in brown paper bags and wrote our names on them with a Sharpie. And that was love, not the written on a cake kind, but the real kind, the kind that shows up without fanfare. My father worked at a shipping company for 22 years and never once complained about it in front of us. My parents were not cold. They were just efficient with their warmth. You had to earn it, and once you did, it was unshakable. I think that is partly why I was so drawn to the Kowalski family when I first met them. They were loud, they were demonstrative, they had opinions about everything, the right way to make pierogies, the correct order for opening Christmas gifts, which lane to drive in on I-94. Sandra Kowalski, my mother-in-law, could fill an entire room just by walking into it. Not because she was physically large, she was not, but because she moved like she had already decided that every space belonged to her. I mistook that for warmth for a very long time. I met my husband Daniel at a work conference in Chicago. He was presenting on supply chain logistics. I was attending on behalf of the small distribution firm where I was an operations manager. He made a dry joke during the Q&A that only about 4 people in the room understood, and I was one of them. And when he found me afterward at the coffee station and said, "You were the only one who laughed," I thought, this is a person I could talk to for a long time. And I was right. That part at least, I got right. Daniel he is good. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because this story is not about whether my husband is a bad person. It is about what happens when a good person has spent 35 years being managed by a woman who does not know the difference between love and control. It is about the space between those two things and how long you can live inside that space before something finally breaks. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday, not a planned romantic Tuesday, just a regular Tuesday night when we were making dinner and the pasta had boiled over and there was tomato sauce on his shirt, and he looked at me in that chaotic kitchen and said, "I do not want to do this with anyone else. Any of it. No ring yet." Just those words, and I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We got married in September of 2019, small ceremony, 42 people, a little venue outside of Ann Arbor with string lights and a bluegrass trio that his college roommate put together. It was exactly what we wanted. Daniel's mother had lobbied hard for a church, for a reception hall, for a guest list that would have tripled our budget, and Daniel had, I thought, held the line. He said, "Mom, this is what Rachel and I want." And she smiled, and she helped fold programs, and she gave a toast that was almost entirely about Daniel. Almost entirely. There was one line about me. One line, and even that line was structured around her, "We are so glad Daniel found someone to take care of him." I smiled. I told myself it was a cultural thing. I told myself that once I was in the family, really in it, things would settle into something warmer. I had heard that story from so many women. Give it time. Once she sees you love him, she will let you in. 3 years later, I was still waiting at the door. And before I go any further, I just want to say that if any part of this is landing close to home for you right now, you might want to stay with me through all 3 parts of this story, because it gets a lot more complicated before it gets any better. And I think some of you might need to hear the ending. Here is the thing about Sandra Kowalski that took me years to fully understand. She was not mean. That is the trap. Mean would have been easy to identify, easy to name, easy to defend yourself against. Sandra was generous. Sandra was present. Sandra showed up with casseroles and birthday cards and strong opinions about throw pillows, and she said she wanted to be close to me. She said it with her whole face, and I wanted to believe her so badly that I cooperated in my own erasure. She had 2 children, Daniel and his younger sister, Brittany. Brittany was her mirror, same laugh, same energy, same way of moving through a room like it was already theirs. The 2 of them together were a closed circuit. There was a frequency between them that I was never quite on. The first time I noticed it was at Thanksgiving, 4 months after Daniel and I got married. We went to Sandra's house in Naperville, big colonial, immaculate yard, a kitchen that looked like a magazine spread and smelled like cinnamon, and something underneath the cinnamon that I could never quite name. I had offered to bring a dish. Sandra had said yes, of course, bring whatever you like. So I made my grandmother's sweet potato casserole. It had been in my family for 50 years. I had made it from memory since I was 14. Sandra tasted it, set down her fork, and said, "We usually do the sweet potatoes a little differently here, but it is very..." She tilted her head. "Interesting. Interesting. Not good. Not I would love the recipe. Interesting. The way you say interesting about something you are too polite to call a mistake." And Brittany said, "Mom makes hers with a praline topping. It is basically a family tradition." And then she looked at me, not with malice, just with the particular blankness of someone who has never considered that you might also have traditions, and said, "You should try it sometime." Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. I smiled. I ate the stuffing, which was excellent, and I filed the whole exchange away in the place where I kept things I did not want to examine too closely. By year 2 of our marriage, that mental file cabinet was getting full. There was the time Sandra redecorated Daniel's old bedroom while we were visiting, which technically was just a room in her house, but she did it while we were there, and she presented the new color scheme to Daniel like she was unveiling something important. And when I said I liked the blue he had before, she said, "Oh, that was always a little dark, I thought." Not disagreeing with me, just overwriting me. There was the time she called Daniel on our 2nd anniversary to tell him about a job opportunity she had found for him, without mentioning it to me first, without considering that we had already discussed his career trajectory, without any acknowledgement that his life was now structured around 2 people, not 1. Daniel thanked her and then came to me apologetically, like a man who had been conditioned to smooth things over and was not even sure anymore why he was apologizing. There was the time she asked me, at a family dinner in front of 7 people, whether I was planning to continue working after the baby. Not in a curious way. In the way of someone who has already decided the answer and is giving you a chance to arrive at it on your own. And here is where I have to be honest with you about my own role in all of this. I let it happen. I know I did. Not because I was weak, I want to say that clearly, but because I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as building something durable. I had watched my own parents absorb conflict quietly for 30 years and remain married, and I thought that was wisdom. I thought that was how it worked. You swallowed the small things so you had energy left for the important ones, but the problem with that strategy is that you have to decide at some point what counts as important. and by the time I finally made that decision, the small things had accumulated into something I no longer recognized. We found out I was pregnant in January. A Thursday morning, 6:32 a.m., me sitting on the bathroom floor of our apartment in Evanston, 2 pink lines on a test that I immediately photographed, and then just held my phone against my chest for a moment, eyes closed. Daniel was still asleep. I went back to bed and lay down beside him and just looked at his face for a while in the gray morning light coming through the curtains. I thought, we are about to become something different. I thought, I am so glad it is with him. He cried a little when I told him, not a lot, just enough. We agreed to wait 10 weeks before telling anyone. We made it to week 9 before Daniel told his mother. I found out because Sandra called me directly, which she almost never did, and said, with a warmth that was so genuine I almost forgot to notice the strange edges around it, I am just so happy for you both. I want to do everything. I mean everything. And I thought, there it is. That word, everything. At first it was harmless. Or it looked harmless. Sandra sent links to strollers. Sandra had opinions about pediatricians. Sandra asked, gently at first, whether we were thinking about the nursery yet. I was 20 weeks along, and the nursery was a spare room with 4 boxes of Daniel's old textbooks in it, so no, Sandra, we had not gotten there yet. But thank you. And then she said, I would love to throw you a shower. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because a mother-in-law offering to throw a baby shower is not, on its face, a hostile act. It is, on its face, generous. And I know that. And at the time, I received it that way, genuinely, with real gratitude. I said yes. I said I would love that. I meant it. The first sign that something was off came about 2 weeks later, when Sandra mentioned, casually, the venue she had already reserved. Not suggested. Reserved. The Harding Room at the Willowbrook Country Club in Naperville, a space that held 120 guests with a private catering staff and a minimum spend of $4,000. I blinked. How many people are we talking about? I asked. Oh, just family and close friends, Sandra said. And then, after a pause, and some of Daniel's colleagues and a few women from our church community, I said, Sandra, I do not really know most of those people. She said, well, that is the point, sweetheart. This is how you get to know them. Look, I tried. I want you to know I tried to make it work within that framework. I told Daniel. Daniel said he would talk to her. He did talk to her, at least. He said he did. What actually happened in that conversation, I will never fully know, because Daniel was then, and is now, a person who has been mediating between his mother's reality and everyone else's for so long that he sometimes mediates without realizing he is doing it. What I know is that after the conversation, the venue stayed. The guest list grew. And then Sandra asked me, with the most pleasant expression in the world, if I had any themes in mind. I said I was thinking something soft, muted colors. Maybe botanical. I loved plants. I had 27 of them in our apartment. Something that felt like me. Sandra nodded thoughtfully. She said, that sounds beautiful. She wrote something in her planner. The theme she selected 2 weeks later was navy blue and silver with a nautical motif. Anchors and lighthouses. A cake shaped like a sailboat. I do not know how to sail. I have never been on a sailboat. I told Daniel this, and he said, I think my dad used to take us to Lake Michigan when we were kids. I said, Daniel, it is my shower. He said, I know it is. I will say something. He said that 3 more times over the following 4 weeks. By week 30 of my pregnancy, the shower had become something I no longer recognized as mine. The venue was Sandra's. The guest list, 87 names, 60 of whom I had never met, was Sandra's. The catering was Sandra's. The florist was a woman Sandra had used for every family event since 1997. The favor bags contained Jordan almonds in navy tulle, which I am allergic to. Jordan almonds. No one asked, and when I mentioned, quietly, to Daniel, not to Sandra, not to Brittany, just to my husband in our own kitchen, that maybe this had gotten a little away from us, he said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "Rachel, can we just let her have this? She is so excited. She does not mean any harm. Can we just let her have this?" My baby shower. My first child. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen, and I thought about all the things I had quietly let other people have over the past 3 years, and I realized, with a clarity that was almost physical, that I had been so busy being accommodating that I had forgotten to notice what was being taken. And then, 10 days before the shower, I found out it was not just being shaped into something I did not recognize. I had been removed from it entirely. If you are still with me right now, thank you. Honestly. Because this next part, this is where I need you to understand what it felt like to be 7 months pregnant and realize that the people who were supposed to welcome you into a family had quietly decided that you were more convenient to the story when you were not in it. If this kind of thing hits close to home for you, please share this with someone who needs to hear it, because this happens more than people talk about. The group text read as follows, and I am not paraphrasing, I memorized these words, because when something lands that cleanly, it stays. It said, "Final update for Saturday, reminder that we are asking guests to keep RSVPs to themselves out of respect for the guest of honor who will be at the spa that morning. We want it to be a full surprise." A surprise. They had reframed the entire event, my shower, the one I had been involved in planning for 10 weeks, the one where they had consulted me on themes and then ignored every answer, into a surprise party. So that my absence would make sense, so that the 87 guests, the church ladies and the country club women and Daniel's colleagues, would arrive to a room decorated in navy and silver, would eat the catered food, would play the game Sandra had chosen, would hear the toast that Brittany had no doubt already written, and they would celebrate. Without me, and then, presumably, I would come home from whatever spa appointment had been fabricated for me, and I would receive the gifts, and I would smile, and Sandra would say, "We just wanted to do something special for you," and that would be the story. That would be the version that got photographed and framed and told at Christmases for the next 15 years. Sandra had not just taken over my shower. She had erased me from it and constructed a narrative where that erasure looked like a gift. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand and the smell of the coffee Daniel had made still drifting in from the kitchen, and I thought, I am 7 months pregnant. I am 31 years old. I have been trying to be good enough for this family for 3 years. And I thought, one more thing. I thought, I am done being the person who lets this keep happening. Daniel was in the kitchen. I could hear him at the counter, the sound of the coffee mug being set down, the exhale, the morning quiet sounds of a person who does not yet know that everything is about to change. I pulled up his contact, typed one sentence, sent it. Then I set my phone face down on the mattress and waited. He came into the bedroom 14 seconds later. I counted, and the look on his face when he saw me, really saw me, the way you see someone when the ordinary morning suddenly becomes something else, told me he finally understood. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Daniel came into the bedroom 14 seconds after I sent that text. I know it was 14 seconds because I counted them. I do not know why I counted. I think my brain needed something precise to hold on to, something with an actual number attached to it, because everything else in that moment felt like it was dissolving at the edges. He stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand and the coffee mug still in his other hand, and he looked at me the way you look at someone when you have just realized that the conversation you are about to have is not the kind you can walk away from unchanged. He said my name, just my name, Rachel. And I said, I need you to read the whole thread. He already had. I could tell by the way he sat down on the edge of the bed, not next to me, not yet, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the mattress, and set his coffee mug on the nightstand with a kind of deliberate care, the way you handle something fragile when your hands are not entirely steady. We did not speak for a moment. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, a car passed on the street. Regular sounds, the kind that keep going even when your world is reorganizing itself around a new truth. And then Daniel said the thing I had both hoped and dreaded he would say. He said, "This is not okay." 3 words. After 3 years of she means well and let her have this and can we just not make it a whole thing? 3 words. And the reason they cracked something open in me was not because they were revelatory, it was because I had needed to hear them for so long that the relief of finally hearing them came mixed with grief for all the times I had not. But I want to be honest with you about what came next, because this is not a story about a husband who suddenly became a different person. Daniel did not flip a switch. He sat on that bed and he struggled, visibly, genuinely struggled, with what it meant to stand fully in my corner for the first time in a way that would have real consequences for his family. And I watched him struggle, and I did not rescue him from it, because I needed to see what he would do when no one made it easier. He asked me to walk him through everything, not just the text, everything from the beginning. The venue he had not fully registered as a problem, the guest list he had assumed I was managing, the theme I had described and watched get replaced. The Jordan almonds. I walked him through it, calmly. I had already processed the part where I needed to fall apart. I had done that in the 11 minutes between when my sister-in-law's forwarded text arrived and when I sent Daniel the message. Those 11 minutes were not pretty. I sat on that bed and I breathed through something that felt like my chest was being compressed from both sides, and I let myself feel exactly how humiliated I was, and then I set it down. Not away, I want to be clear. You do not put something like that away. You set it somewhere accessible, where you can use it later. Daniel listened to the whole account without interrupting, which, if you know Daniel, tells you something about the state he was in. He is a talker. He processes out loud. The fact that he went quiet and stayed quiet meant that something was landing differently than it had before. When I finished, he said, "Why did you not tell me how bad it had gotten?" And I said, "Daniel, I told you every single time. You told me to let her have it." He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the window, looked back at me. He said, "You are right. I did say that. Look, I am not going to dramatize this moment into something it was not. There was no grand speech. There were no cinematic tears. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more significant, because what Daniel did in the next 10 minutes was not emotional, it was structural. He made a series of decisions that were calm and deliberate and entirely irreversible. He picked up his phone, he opened his contacts, he scrolled to a name. I said, "Who are you calling?" He said, "The venue." I want to tell you that I cheered. I want to tell you that I felt a surge of vindication and warmth and all of the things you are supposed to feel when your partner finally shows up fully. And there was some of that. There was. But there was also something else underneath it, something more complicated and harder to name. Because watching Daniel pick up that phone meant watching him choose, in real time, to do something that could not be undone. And even though his mother had earned every consequence that was about to come, I was the one who had to live in the aftermath of that choice alongside him. And that weight was not nothing. I sat on our bed. I put my hand on my stomach, the way you do, automatically, when you are 7 months pregnant, the way it becomes a reflex before you even know you are doing it. And I listened to my husband make the first of what would eventually be 6 phone calls. 6 vendors, 6 cancellations, all in one morning. Here is the thing about discovering that you have been systematically sidelined. There is a period of approximately 48 hours during which you exist in a strange double state. On the outside, you are functional. You make coffee. You answer emails. You say I am fine to the right people. On the inside, You are conducting an audit. You go back through everything, every interaction, every conversation you filed away, every moment where something felt slightly off, but you told yourself you were being too sensitive, too territorial, too attached to things that did not matter. And you look at all of it through the new lens, the one you now have because someone forwarded you a group text they were not supposed to, and the picture that emerges is not a dramatic one. It is worse than dramatic. It is methodical. Sandra Kowalski had not acted out of cruelty. That is the thing I had to sit with. She had not woken up one morning and decided to harm me. What she had done was something quieter and in some ways more difficult to defend against. She had simply proceeded as though my preferences were a courtesy she could extend or withdraw at her discretion. As though my role in my own life events was participatory rather than central. As though I was a guest in a story she was already writing, and guests do not get editorial control. I started keeping notes. I know that sounds clinical, and maybe it was, but I want to push back on the idea that a woman who starts keeping careful records of what has been done to her is somehow being calculating in a negative sense. What she is being is prepared. And there's nothing wrong with preparation. I had text messages, I had emails, I had a screenshot of the group text that had been forwarded to me. I had the original invitation Sandra had sent me, the one with my name in cursive, which listed the venue, the date, the time, and the note at the bottom that said, "Your input is so important to us." I had a saved voicemail from Sandra, recorded 3 weeks earlier, in which she said, and I had saved this, I do not fully know why I had saved it, maybe some part of me already knew, in which she said, "We have everything handled, you just show up and enjoy yourself." I had texts between me and Daniel in which I had flagged each concern as it arose, and in which his responses, kind, mediating, well-intentioned, amounted to a paper trail of my objections being received and gently deprioritized. I was not angry at Daniel for those texts. I want to be clear about that. What I felt when I read them back was something closer to sadness, because they revealed a pattern I had not named clearly enough in real time, that I had been raising concerns, and they had been heard, and then they had been classified as manageable rather than serious, and that classification had been made by a man who loved me but who had a 35-year-old reflex that told him his mother's comfort was a variable worth protecting. That reflex was not going to fix itself overnight, but it was, as of that Thursday morning, being interrupted, forcibly, by 6 phone calls. Let me tell you about those 6 calls. The Willowbrook Country Club was first. Daniel spoke to the events coordinator. He identified himself as the account holder. Sandra had booked everything under his name, which I later realized was itself a revealing detail. He explained that there had been a change in plans and he needed to cancel the reservation. The coordinator asked about the deposit. Daniel said he understood there would be a forfeiture. The coordinator confirmed $1,200, non-refundable. Daniel said, "That is fine, $1,200, gone." And he said that is fine, without hesitation, without asking me to confirm, without stopping to calculate. I noted that. I noted what it meant about how seriously he was taking this now versus how seriously he had taken my concerns 3 weeks ago. I did not say anything about it in the moment. Some things you bank for later. The caterer was second. A woman named Patricia, who Sandra had used for a decade, and who, when Daniel explained the cancellation, said, "Oh, Sandra is not going to be happy about this." Not as a warning, just as a statement of fact, the way you state a fact that you assume both parties already know and are accounting for. Daniel said, "I understand," and completed the cancellation. Patricia's comment stayed with me. "Oh, Sandra is not going to be happy about this." Not, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Not, "Is there a way to work something out?" Just an assumption, absorbed, reflexive, unquestioned, that Sandra's happiness was the relevant metric. That what Sandra wanted was the gravitational center of this situation. That assumption was not Patricia's fault. She had probably operated inside Sandra's gravitational field for years without ever being given reason to question it. But it told me something important about the world Sandra had built. a world in which her preferences were so consistently treated as primary that even the vendors had internalized it. The florist was third. The photographer was fourth. A woman who ran party games and entertainment for showers and corporate events was fifth. Sandra had booked her specifically for the shower games, which, when I looked up her website afterward, I found included a segment called How Well Does Mom Know Baby? A game in which guests guess the mother's preferences. The irony of that particular game being booked for a shower I was not invited to attend was not lost on me. The cake. The cake was sixth. Sandra had ordered a custom nautical cake from a bakery in Naperville, the sailboat cake, the one I had never requested, the one built around Daniel's childhood memory of Lake Michigan. It had been ordered 3 weeks in advance. The baker had a 48-hour cancellation policy. Daniel called outside of that window. The baker said she was sorry, but she could not refund the deposit. The cake was already half constructed. Daniel said, "Could you change the design?" A pause. "Then, what did you have in mind?" Daniel looked at me. I looked back at him. I said, "Botanical. Green, soft colors, something that looks like a garden." The baker said she could do something along those lines. She would need to charge a small modification fee. Daniel said that was fine. I do not know why the cake mattered to me as much as it did. In the context of everything else, the venue, the guest list, the erasure, the months of accumulated small violences, a cake should have been the least of it. But there was something about the idea of that sailboat being dismantled and replaced with something green and living, and mine, that felt more meaningful than I know how to explain without sounding irrational. So I am just going to let it be irrational and move on. I want to ask you something honestly, and I really do want to know. If you had been in my position at any point in those 3 years, would you have spoken up sooner? Because I have asked myself that question more times than I can count. And I genuinely do not have a clean answer. Drop it in the comments, because I think this is one of those things where everyone is certain about what they would do until they are actually inside it. Sandra found out about the cancellations at 11:47 in the morning. I know the time because Daniel's phone rang at 11:47 and the name on the screen was Mom, and he looked at me and I said put it on speaker, and he did. And I want you to understand that asking him to do that was not a small thing. That was me saying, I will no longer be a conversation that happens around you. I am in the room. I am in this. Sandra's voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of someone who had lost her composure. That is important. If she had screamed, if she had cried, if she had said something unhinged, that would have been easier to categorize. What she did instead was something I can only describe as controlled damage assessment. Her voice was measured. It was reasonable. It was the voice of a woman who had spent decades navigating conflict by refusing to acknowledge that conflict existed. She said, "Daniel, I just got off the phone with Patricia. Can you help me understand what is happening?" Daniel said, "Mom, I think you know what is happening." A pause. "Then I was trying to do something special." Daniel said, "You planned a shower for my wife and arranged for my wife not to be there." Another pause. Longer. I could hear Sandra breathing. I could hear, somewhere in the background of her house, the television, a morning news program, a voice talking about something distant and unrelated, going on completely indifferent to the conversation happening in the foreground. Sandra said, "It was meant to be a surprise. Rachel has been so stressed. I thought it would be a gift." A morning at the spa, coming home to, Daniel said, "Mom, stop." He had never said that to her before. Not like that. Not with that particular flatness that means, I see the construction you are building, and I am not going to stand inside it with you. She stopped. Daniel said, "Rachel is not stressed about the shower. Rachel is upset because the shower became something that was not about her, and instead of listening when she raised that, I told her to let you have it. That was my mistake. I am not going to keep making it." Sandra said, "I do not understand why everything I try to do for this family gets turned into something negative." And there it was. The pivot. The move I had been watching Sandra make for 3 years, so smoothly and so consistently that I had almost stopped noticing it, the redirect. The moment where the conversation about what she had done became a conversation about how she was being treated. The moment where the person who caused the harm became the person who was misunderstood. I had seen it with the sweet potato casserole. I had seen it after every corrected plan, every ignored preference, every moment where my existence in the family required Sandra to make space she had not allocated. Always the same move, a shift from the specific to the general, from the action to the feeling, from what happened to how unfair it was that anyone noticed. Daniel did not follow her into that redirect. That was new. He said, "Mom, I have canceled the vendors. The shower is going to be rescheduled. Rachel will be involved in every decision from here. I need you to understand that, and I need you to give us some space right now." Sandra said, "I cannot believe you are doing this to me." Daniel said, "I love you. I will call you later in the week." And he hung up. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there with his back to me for a moment, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the particular tension of someone who has just done something that cost them something real and is sitting with the cost. I walked over and stood beside him, not behind him, beside him. I did not say anything. I just stood there. After a moment, he reached over and took my hand. We stood like that in our kitchen in Evanston for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum. Sandra did not call back that day. She did something more sophisticated than calling back. She deployed Brittany. Brittany texted Daniel at 2:15 in the afternoon. The message was long. I am not going to read it word for word, but the architecture of it was familiar. It began with concern, moved through confusion, arrived at gentle accusation, and concluded with an appeal to family loyalty. The phrase "Mom is devastated" appeared twice. The phrase "I do not think Rachel understands how much effort went into this" appeared once. The phrase "We are all just trying to love your family" appeared in the final paragraph, which is the emotional closer, the one designed to make you feel that disagreement is equivalent to rejection. Daniel read it, showed it to me, said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing yet." He nodded. He put his phone face down. That was new too. By 6 in the evening, 3 of Sandra's friends from her church community had texted or called Daniel, not me, Daniel, expressing their sadness about the shower being canceled and their hope that things would be sorted out. One of them, a woman named Carolyn, who I had met exactly twice, sent a text that said, "I am sure Sandra just wanted to do something beautiful." These misunderstandings happen in families. Misunderstanding. That word. I want to talk about that word for a moment because it is doing a lot of work in the narrative that Sandra's circle was constructing. A misunderstanding implies that two parties had different interpretations of the same event, that both parties were operating in good faith and simply arrived at different conclusions. A misunderstanding is the kind of thing that resolves with a conversation and a hug and maybe a casserole. What had happened was not a misunderstanding. What had happened was that a woman had planned a celebration for my pregnancy and arranged deliberately with phone calls and scheduling and logistical coordination for me not to be present at it. And then, when discovered, had characterized that arrangement as a gift. Those are not the same thing. And the fact that her network of support was reaching for the word misunderstanding told me everything I needed to know about the story Sandra was already telling. I was the difficult one. I was the one who could not accept a gesture of love. I was the one who had made this ugly by insisting on having feelings about it. I have to tell you, I have a very specific memory from that evening. Daniel and I had ordered takeout, Thai food from a place 2 blocks away, and we were sitting at the kitchen table eating pad see ew in near silence when his phone lit up with the 4th message from Sandra's network in 3 hours. He looked at it, set the phone down without responding, and went back to his food. I looked at him, across the table. I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I am tired." I said, "I know." He said, I should have done this a long time ago. I said, yes. But you are doing it now. And he nodded, and we finished our food, and outside the window it had started to rain, a light April rain, the kind that does not commit to anything, just sits in the air and makes everything slightly damp, and I thought, this is what it feels like when things actually start to change. Not a dramatic announcement, not a clear sky after the storm, just two people eating takeout in the rain, choosing, quietly and definitively, to be on the same side. If you are still here, if you have been with me through both parts of this story, I want you to know that what comes next is the part that I still think about. The part where we stopped being reactive and started being intentional. If this kind of story matters to you, it would mean a lot to me if you subscribed before part 3, because part 3 is where everything Sandra built comes undone, and the way it happens is not what you would expect. We gave it 4 days before we made any further moves. That was intentional. Not because we needed the time to decide what to do, we knew what we wanted to do, but because there is a kind of pressure that comes from a mobilized family network, and that pressure is designed to make you act before you are ready, to make you apologize before you have finished understanding what you are apologizing for, to pull you back into the old pattern before the new one has a chance to take hold. We did not respond to Brittany's text, we did not call Sandra, we did not engage with Carolyn or the other women from the church group. We let the silence do what silence does when it is held with intention rather than fear. It communicates that the terms have changed. On day 5, I called my best friend Vanessa. Vanessa Okafor. I want to say her name properly because she deserves to be named in this story. Vanessa and I have been friends since we were both 23 and working adjacent desks at a logistics firm in Columbus, and she is the kind of person who listens to the whole thing before she says a single word, and then when she speaks, what she says is almost always exactly right. I told her everything. She listened. And when I finished, she said, "What do you actually want the shower to look like? Not, what are you going to do about Sandra? Not, how do you feel? Just the clear, practical, forward-looking question. What do you want?" I said small. My people, my house, plants everywhere, good food that I actually like, no nautical theme, no sailboats, no Jordan almonds within a 1-mile radius. Vanessa said, "Done. Give me the date." We planned the shower in 4 days. Vanessa handled the coordination. My mother flew in from Columbus. My college roommate Diane drove up from Indianapolis. Daniel's cousin Maya, who is nothing like the rest of the Kowalski family, in the best possible way, said she would be there and asked if she should bring wine or flowers, and when I said flowers, she showed up with enough plants to open a nursery. The guest list was 17 people. 17 people who actually knew me, who knew that I took my coffee with oat milk and that I had a thing about clean windowsills, and that I had been terrified and excited and completely unprepared for motherhood in equal measure, and that I needed, more than anything that morning, to be seen by people who could actually see me. We held it on a Saturday, 12 days after the original date. In our apartment, the Botanical cake arrived at 10 in the morning, the same baker, the modified design, green and white and soft pink, leaves and small flowers, my name on it in my handwriting style, which Vanessa had somehow communicated to the baker by sending her a photo of a birthday card I had written. I stood in the kitchen and looked at that cake for a long moment. I am not someone who cries easily in front of people. I cried in front of Vanessa that morning, and she handed me a dish towel and said, "Do not you dare ruin your mascara before anyone gets here," and I laughed. And the laugh was real, and that was when I knew I was going to be okay. The shower was everything the other one was not. Loud in the right ways. Quiet in the right ways. Full of people who brought gifts that were chosen with specific knowledge of who I was. Books. Not just baby books, but actual books for me. Because Vanessa had told everyone that I had stopped reading during the first trimester and needed to come back to it. A weighted blanket in the dusty sage green that I had mentioned wanting once in passing. a hand-painted name card for the nursery in a style that matched the botanical prints I had framed above my desk. At some point in the afternoon, I sat on the couch surrounded by the people I loved most, and I looked around the room, at my mother laughing at something Daniel's cousin Maya said, at Vanessa refilling someone's sparkling water, at the plants clustered in the corner catching the afternoon light, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. This is what it would have felt like all along if I had been given the chance to build it. Sandra did not contact us for 9 days after the shower. 9 days of silence from a woman who had, in the 3 years I had known her, rarely gone 9 hours without some form of communication with her son. The silence was not neutral. Nothing about Sandra was ever neutral. She communicated in every register, including absence, and those 9 days were one of the loudest things she had ever said. Brittany sent one text during that period to Daniel, which said only, "Mom is really hurting." Daniel replied, "I hope she gets some support. I know this because he showed me the exchange before he sent it, and I said that was fair, and he sent it." On the 9th day, Daniel called his mother, not because she had asked him to, not because we had discussed it and agreed it was time. He called because he is still her son, and whatever she had done, whatever had been broken in that relationship, he was not going to pretend it had not mattered before. I did not listen to that call. I was in the nursery. We had started on the nursery finally, cleared out the textbooks, painted the walls a warm white, and I could hear the low murmur of Daniel's voice from the other room, and I painted a section of the accent wall, and I did not try to make out the words. He came in afterward, sat on the floor beside me. He said, "She apologized." I said, "What kind?" He thought about it. He is careful with language when it matters, Daniel. He said, "The kind where she is sorry it happened, not quite the kind where she understands why it was wrong." I nodded. I put my paintbrush back in the tray. I said, "That is a start." And I meant it. I want you to know I meant it. Because the alternative, deciding that the only acceptable outcome was a full reckoning, a complete transformation, an apology so perfect it retroactively healed everything, that alternative was not something I was willing to organize my life around. Not with a baby coming, not with a marriage I wanted to protect, not with the full knowledge that people like Sandra Kowalski do not change in one phone call. They change, if they change at all, slowly and imperfectly, and only when the cost of not changing becomes higher than the cost of shifting. The cost, in this case, had just gotten very high. But here is the thing. Here is the thing that I did not tell Daniel that afternoon, sitting on the floor of the nursery with paint on my hands. The apology was not what I was still thinking about. What I was still thinking about was something Brittany had said in her text, not to Daniel, but in the original group thread, the one I was not supposed to see. There was a line that had not made sense to me at the time, a line I had set aside in the first shock of reading it, but that had been sitting in the back of my mind since. She had written, "Make sure everything is arranged the way Mom planned it from the beginning." From the beginning. Not from when the planning started, from the beginning. Deliberate, a door opening onto something darker. I thought about when this had all started. I thought about the venue Sandra had already reserved when she first offered to host the shower, reserved before she asked me, before I said yes. I thought about the guest list that had materialized, fully formed. I thought about the vendors who had all been contacted within the same 2-week window, early in the planning, before I had provided a single preference. I thought about the word choice. Arranged, the way Mom planned it, from the beginning. This was not a shower that had slowly evolved away from my vision through a series of well-meaning overreaches. This had been planned this way from the start, before I was even fully consulted, before the invitation with my name in cursive had been sent. Pause. Music note holds, unresolved. The question I sat with in that nursery, paintbrush in hand, was not whether I could forgive Sandra Kowalski. The question was, What else had been arranged from the beginning that I did not know about yet? Part 3 is the ending, and I want to warn you, it is not a clean one. Because what I found out in the weeks that followed the shower was not one thing. It was several things, small things that connected to form a picture I had not been ready to see. A pattern that went back further than I had understood. And what Daniel did when I showed him that picture, quietly, in our kitchen, over cups of coffee that went cold while we talked, was the moment that determined what kind of marriage we were going to have. What kind of family we were going to be. What kind of person I had been waiting 3 years to become. The venue confirmation email was the first thing I found. I want to be careful about how I explain this because the details matter and I do not want to move past them too quickly. When Sandra had offered to host the shower, that conversation, the one where I had said yes with genuine gratitude, where I had thought, this is what it looks like when a mother-in-law tries, I had been 18 weeks pregnant. That was the offer date. I remembered it clearly because I had just come from my anatomy scan, and Daniel and I had gone to lunch afterward, and we had talked about names, and we were still in that golden window where everything felt possible. The venue confirmation email, which Sandra had forwarded to Daniel at some point during the planning as a logistical update, was dated 3 weeks before that conversation. 3 weeks before Sandra offered to host the shower, she had already reserved the Harding room at the Willowbrook Country Club. She had not offered to throw a shower and then found a venue. She had booked a venue and then offered to throw a shower. The offer had not been the beginning of the plan. The offer had been the moment she introduced me to a plan that was already in motion. I sat with that for a long time. I made myself sit with it before I moved to the next thing, because I did not want to sprint past the weight of it. This was not a woman who had gotten carried away with enthusiasm. This was a woman who had decided what was going to happen and then constructed the appearance of collaboration around that decision. The invitation to participate had never been real. It had been a formality, a courtesy extended toward someone she had already decided was going to be managed rather than included. I wrote it down. Date of offer, date of venue booking. The gap between them, 22 days. Then I kept going. The florist Sandra had used, the woman she had employed for every family event since 1997, had a website with a booking portal. Out of what I can only describe as a very particular kind of focused curiosity, I reached out through the contact form and asked, without identifying myself, whether the portal kept records of initial consultation dates. The florist, a warm woman named Georgette, who I genuinely felt bad about involving, wrote back and said that yes, she kept records going back several years, and that she had actually been so sorry to hear the event was canceled, that Sandra had been a client of hers for a long time. I wrote back and said I was a family member trying to coordinate a rescheduled event, and asked when the original consultation had taken place. Georgette checked her records. The initial consultation for the shower floral arrangements had occurred 4 weeks before Sandra offered to host it. Very quiet. Not dramatic, just precise. 4 weeks. The florist had been briefed on the color scheme, on the nautical theme, on the scale of the arrangements, 4 weeks before I was asked whether I had any themes in mind. The question Sandra had put to me, "Do you have any themes in mind, sweetheart?" had not been a question. It had been a performance. She had already chosen the theme. She had already briefed the vendors. She was asking me because asking me was the version of events she needed me to participate in. She needed me to be consulted so that she could say later that I had been consulted. I added the florist date to my notes. Then I looked at the caterer, Patricia. Daniel still had the original vendor contract in his email. Sandra had added him to correspondences, again because having his name on things gave them a structural legitimacy she needed. The caterer contract had an initial deposit date. I found it, 5 weeks before Sandra offered to host the shower. The caterer had been contracted, paid a deposit, and given a preliminary menu, a menu I had never been shown, let alone contributed to, 5 weeks before I said yes to anything. I put my pen down. I looked at what I had written. The venue booked 22 days before the offer. The florist briefed 28 days before the offer. The caterer contracted 35 days before the offer. Sandra had not offered to host a baby shower for her daughter-in-law. Sandra had planned a party and then, at some point when the logistics were already locked, had decided to invite the baby's mother. And here is the thing that I turned over in my mind for the rest of that afternoon, and that I am still turning over now. What was the original plan for me? Was the spa appointment always part of it? Had she always intended for me to be absent, or had I been in the original version, present, grateful, receiving, and had something shifted along the way, some conversation or calculation I was not part of, that led to the decision that it would be cleaner, neater, more controllable if I simply was not there? I do not have the answer to that question. I want to be honest about that. What I have is the timeline. What I have is the record. And what the record shows me is that from the very first moment this event existed, I had never been its author. I had been its subject. And there is a profound difference between those two things that I do not have adequate words for, even now. I showed Daniel that evening. We were in the kitchen. It was a Wednesday. I remember because Daniel had gotten home late from work, and we were eating leftovers, the end-of-week kind, the kind where you combine whatever is in containers in the refrigerator and call it dinner, and I had my notes open on my laptop on the kitchen table. I said, I need to show you something. And I need you to look at the dates. He looked. He went through it the way Daniel goes through information when he is being careful, methodically, without reacting until he has the whole picture. He scrolled. He cross-referenced with his own email. He went quiet in the particular way that is different from his regular quiet, the way where you can see him recalibrating. When he finished, he closed the laptop. Gently, set his hands flat on the table. He said, she booked the caterer before she even asked you. I said 5 weeks before. He said, and she asked you what theme you wanted. I said, after the florist had already been briefed on the nautical design. He did not say anything for a moment. Outside, a siren passed on the street, the far-off kind, not close, just the city doing what cities do. The leftover containers were still on the table. His fork was resting against the edge of his plate at the angle of a conversation that had been interrupted and was not going back to normal. He said, she asked you what you wanted because she needed you to feel included. Not because your answer was going to change anything. I said yes. He said, Rachel, I am so sorry. And I said, and I want to be careful here about the tone, because this was not an accusation, this was just a true statement delivered as gently as I could manage. I know you are. But I need you to understand that sorry is the beginning of something, not the end of it. Because this is not the first time she has done something like this. This is the first time we have the paperwork. Daniel looked at me across the table. The overhead light in our kitchen was slightly too bright. We had always meant to get a dimmer switch, and in that light I could see the specific expression on his face that I had learned to read over 4 years together. The one that meant he was not defending anymore. The one that meant something had settled. He said, what do you need from me? Not, what do we do about my mother? Not, how do we fix this? What do you need from me? I told him. I said I needed a boundary that was real and not negotiable. Not a boundary we announced with drama or issued as an ultimatum. I was not interested in performing this for anyone. I needed a boundary that was simply true. A change in structure that reflected the new reality of what we knew and what we were not willing to accept anymore. I said Sandra would not be involved in planning anything related to our child going forward. Not birthdays, not holidays at her house that we were expected to simply appear at on her schedule. Not decisions about how we raised our son. We knew by then it was a boy. We had known for several weeks his name was going to be Eli. Not a single decision that belonged to us would be made with Sandra's input unless we chose to offer it. And we would offer it when we decided to. On our terms. I said, I was not asking her to disappear from our lives. I was not asking Daniel to end his relationship with his mother. What I was asking for was a reorganization of the architecture. a change in who was at the center of our family's story. Daniel said, "And if she cannot accept that?" I said, "Then she accepts less access. Not as a punishment, just as a natural consequence of the space she has already taken." He nodded slowly. He picked up his fork. He set it back down. He said, "I will call her tomorrow." I said, "I know." He said, "It is not going to go well." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I am going to do it anyway." Quiet. Certain. I believed him. For the first time in our marriage, in the part of our marriage that had anything to do with Sandra, I believed him completely and without reservation. Not because he had proven himself suddenly or dramatically, but because I had watched him, over the preceding 10 days, make a series of small and irreversible choices that added up to something larger. The 6 phone calls. The speakerphone. The text to Brittany. The refusal to manage me back toward comfort. Each one of those choices had been a data point, and together they formed a picture I could trust. I got up and cleared the containers from the table. I rinsed them in the sink and stacked them by the dish rack, and I stood there for a moment with the water running over my hands, and I thought, this is what it feels like when you stop performing okay and start actually building it. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like work. The real kind. Daniel called his mother the next morning. He did not tell me everything that was said, and I did not ask him to. What he told me was the structure of it, the shape of the conversation, the decisions that had been communicated and received. I think that was the right call. There is a version of this where I would have needed to be in the room, on the speakerphone again, and I had made my peace with the fact that this particular conversation was one that Daniel needed to have as a son, not as a husband performing accountability for. An audience. What he told me, he had told Sandra about the timeline, the venue booking date, the florist, the caterer. He had laid it out factually, without editorializing, the way you present evidence to someone when you want them to understand that you are not operating from emotion, you are operating from record. Sandra's response, according to Daniel, had moved through several phases. The first phase was denial, not aggressive denial, measured, almost convincing denial. She had said that the dates were not what he was interpreting them to be, that she had spoken to Georgette months earlier about availability in general, not specifically for this event, that the caterer contract was standard, just a preliminary hold, that he was reading intention into logistics. Daniel had said, "Mom, the nautical theme was briefed to the florist before Rachel was asked what theme she wanted. That is not a logistics issue." The second phase was deflection. Sandra had said that she had put an enormous amount of love and effort into something she believed would bring joy to her family, and that she was finding it very painful to have that effort characterized as deceptive when all she had ever wanted was to celebrate her grandchild. Daniel had said, "I understand that your intention was to celebrate. The impact was different from the intention." Both things are true. The third phase, and this is the one that Daniel told me about last, quietly, sitting on the edge of the couch that evening, was the thing Sandra said that she should not have said. The thing that I believe she had been thinking for a very long time and had finally run out of the composure required to keep contained. She said, "I just do not understand why everything has to be about Rachel. Everything has to be about Rachel. My baby shower, my pregnancy, my first child. Why does everything have to be about me?" Daniel told me he had been quiet for a moment after she said it. And then he had said, carefully and clearly and without raising his voice, "Because Rachel is my wife. Because this is her child. Because this is her life. And if that is a difficult reality for you to organize yourself around, then we are going to need significantly more space between us than we have had. Not forever, but for now. Until we figure out whether that can change." Sandra had cried. Daniel had stayed on the phone. He had not apologized, and he had not softened, and he had not redirected. He had simply stayed present in the discomfort he had caused, the necessary kind, the kind that is the price of saying something true, and when his mother's crying slowed, he had said, "I love you. I will call you in a few weeks. Please give us some time." and then he had hung up. And he had sat with his phone in his hand for a while. And then he had come to find me. I was in the nursery. Again, I had been spending a lot of time in there, not escaping, exactly, more like orienting, getting familiar with the room that Eli was going to come home to, learning the light at different times of day. Daniel stood in the doorway, and I looked at him, and he said, "It is done." I said, "How are you?" He said, "I do not know yet." I said, "That is okay." He came and sat on the floor beside me. We sat there in the early morning light with the paint smell still faint in the air and the sound of the street coming through the window, and I did not try to make him feel better or worse. I just sat next to him. After a while, he said, "She is not going to change overnight." I said, "No." He said, "This is going to take a long time." I said, "I know. I am not going anywhere." He leaned his head back against the wall. He said, "Eli is going to have a grandmother." I said, "On the terms we set." "Yes." He said, "On the terms we set." And for the first time in our marriage, that sentence, our terms, felt like something we had both actually signed. Before I get to the ending of this, and there is an ending, a real one, not a clean one, I want to say something. If you have been with me through all 3 parts of this story, you already know that what I am about to tell you is not a fairy tale resolution. It is something messier and more honest than that. And if that is the kind of story that matters to you, the real kind, not the wrapped up kind, then please subscribe before you leave, because that is the only kind of story I know how to tell, and I will keep telling them. Eli was born on a Tuesday in June. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, a face so new it looked like the beginning of something the world had not seen yet, because it was. Because every face like that is. Daniel cried. I did not cry during the delivery. I was too focused, too present, too busy, being inside the most physical experience of my life to have space for tears. I cried about an hour later, when they had cleaned him and swaddled him and laid him on my chest, and I looked down at this person who had been a concept and was now a weight, an actual weight in my arms, and I thought, everything I did in the last 3 months was for this. Every conversation, every confrontation, every evening in the nursery with paint on my hands. This. My mother was in the waiting room. Vanessa was in the waiting room. Daniel's cousin Maya had driven 3 hours without being asked. Sandra was not there. That had been our decision, or more accurately, it had been the natural result of the space we had created. We had not told her not to come. We had simply not issued an invitation, and Sandra, who understood by then that the gravitational rules had changed, had not shown up uninvited. That was, in its own way, a kind of progress. She sent flowers, white roses and greenery, no note at first, just the flowers. And then, an hour later, a text to Daniel that said, "I hope Rachel and the baby are well. Take all the time you need. Take all the time you need." I read that text over Daniel's shoulder in the hospital room with Eli on my chest, and I felt something complicated move through me. Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever in the complete sense, because I think forgiveness is a process and not a destination, and I was only a few hours into it. But something that was the first molecule of the next chapter. Here is what the following months looked like, because I want to be honest with you and not leave you with a version that tidies things up more than they deserve. Sandra and Daniel spoke regularly, not with the old frequency. That reflex had been interrupted and had not fully reestablished itself, but consistently. Every week or so, sometimes more, the conversations were different, shorter in some ways, more boundaried. Daniel told me about them in the way that partners tell each other things when they have agreed to be transparent, not every word, but the shape of it, the direction things were moving. Sandra met Eli when he was 6 weeks old. We drove to Naperville on a Sunday afternoon. I want to tell you that I was completely at ease. I was not. I sat in the passenger seat of our car with Eli in his car seat behind me, and I felt something that I can only describe as braced. The particular feeling of a person who has learned, the hard way, that environments can shift without warning, and who has trained themselves to stay alert in spaces where that shift has happened before. Sandra was at the door when we pulled up. She was wearing a blue sweater. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but dimensionally, like something had been renegotiated in the space she occupied. She looked at me first, not at Eli, at me. She said, "Thank you for coming." Not, "I am so glad you are here." Not, "Welcome. Thank you for coming." Like she understood that it had cost me something and was acknowledging the cost. It was not an apology, it was not a transformation, but it was a recognition. And recognition from someone who had spent 3 years not quite seeing me was more than I had expected. I said, "Of course." And we went inside. Brittany was there. We were careful with each other in the particular way of two people who know exactly where the fault lines run and are choosing, for the afternoon, to walk around them. That is not resolution. That is management. But management is not nothing. Management is the thing you do while you are working towards something better. Sandra held Eli. She held him with the particular competence of someone who has held babies before and knows what she is doing, and she looked at him with an expression I had never seen on her face, something unguarded, something that was not about performance or presentation or the image of what the moment should look like. She just looked at him. She said, very quietly, mostly to herself, "There you are." I am not going to tell you that moment healed everything. It did not. I am not going to tell you that Sandra and I became close in the months that followed. We did not. Not in the way that word usually means. What we became was something more careful and more honest. A relationship built on what was actually there rather than what we had both been performing around. She stopped making decisions for us. Not all at once. Old patterns do not dissolve overnight. But when she started to reach, Daniel redirected. And over time, the reaching became less frequent. Not because she had fundamentally changed as a person, but because the cost of reaching had changed. The architecture was different. The gravitational center had shifted. We were the center now. Daniel and me and Eli in our apartment in Evanston with 27 plants and a botanical nursery and a cake recipe I was going to teach my son when he was old enough to stand at the counter beside me. My grandmother's sweet potato casserole. From memory, without apology. I want to end with something that is not a conclusion, because I do not think this story has a clean conclusion. I think it has a direction. And directions are different from conclusions. They are ongoing, they require maintenance, they can be lost and recalibrated. The direction we are moving in is better than where we were. That is true. The version of my marriage that exists now, the one where Daniel and I have had the hardest conversations and come out the other side still choosing each other, is more real and more durable than the version that existed a year ago. The version of myself that exists now, the one that kept notes and asked questions and stopped accepting the word misunderstanding as a substitute for accountability, I like her better than the woman who kept filing things in the mental cabinet labeled for later. But here is the moral question I cannot shake. The one I sit with when Eli is asleep and the apartment is quiet and I have more than 30 seconds to think. What did Sandra actually want? Not in the strategic sense. I know what she wanted in that sense. I have the timeline to prove it. What I mean is, underneath the management, underneath the control, underneath every decision she made that was really about keeping herself at the center of a story that was always going to belong to someone else, what was she actually afraid of losing? Because I think, if I am being honest and trying to see her fully rather than just as the antagonist in my own story, I think she was afraid of becoming peripheral, of her son having a life so complete and so self-contained that her role in it reduced to something smaller than she had planned for. I think that fear is real. And I think it is also not an excuse. And I think holding both of those things simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other, is the actual work. Not forgiving her completely, not condemning her entirely, just seeing her clearly. A woman who loved her son in a way that was also about her. A woman who planned a party and forgot to leave room for the person it was supposed to honor. A woman who said, "Why does everything have to be about Rachel, about a baby shower?" And a woman who, 6 weeks later, stood on her front porch in a blue sweater and said thank you for coming, and meant it, and looked at my son with her guard completely down for the first time. All of those things are the same woman. Very quiet. Final. I do not know what to do with that yet. I am working on it. Some days I am closer than others. Some days I am in the nursery watching Eli sleep, and I think, he is going to know his grandmother, and that is going to be complicated, and the complication is going to be worth it. Some days I think, 3 years of filing things away for later, and the thing that finally broke it open was a group text forwarded by accident. Some days I think about the invitation, cream-colored, my name in cursive. Your input is so important to us, and I think, I should have said something the first time I felt the door starting to close. I know that now, but when you love someone, when you love a family, or the idea of a family, or the version of yourself that fits inside that family, you choose to be optimistic. You file things away. You say, it will get better, give it time, she means well. And sometimes you are right, and sometimes you need a group text forwarded by accident to remind you that optimism without boundaries is just another word for waiting. Music settles to almost nothing. My name is Rachel. I have a son named Eli who woke up at 3 this morning and looked at me like I was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. I have a husband who made 6 phone calls on a Thursday morning and said that is fine about a $1,200 deposit and meant every word. I have 27 plants and a botanical nursery and a grandmother's recipe I am keeping. And I have a story that is still going. That part, at least, I am sure of. If this story found something in you, if any part of it felt like something you have lived or are living right now, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Not to compare stories, not to tell me what you would have done differently, just to say, I heard this. That is enough. And if you know someone who is still in the part of the story before the group text, still filing things away, still saying she means well, still standing at a door that is slowly closing, maybe send this to them. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is just knowing someone else made it through.